Coming up on tonight's This Week in Politics, mass shootings in America. Two of them 13 hours apart in El Paso, Texas and Dayton, Ohio. Both involving suspects with semi-automatic weapons taking aim. In El Paso, 22 killed, 24 injured. In Dayton, 9 killed, 27 injured.
And the reality is, we're fed up with this.
Coming up tonight, our interview with Chris Brown, president of the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. She's calling on Washington to make changes to existing gun laws. And good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Allen. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. We will begin here this evening by talking about these mass shootings with South Dakota Congressman Dusty Johnson. I was able to speak with him following this week's Ag Appreciation Lunch at the Sioux Empire Fair. And my first question involved his reaction last Sunday morning when he learned there had been 2 mass shootings in America.
How do you communicate the world we're living in to young people who are going to have a hard time comprehending that kind of evil? And make no bones about it, it is evil. I mean, this kind of violence, this kind of bigotry, this kind of hate, this kind of white supremacism, this kind of desire to inflict pain on others. I mean, this is evil.
South Dakota Congressman Dusty Johnson tells me he was horrified to learn of the violence that played out in Dayton, Ohio in the early morning hours of last Sunday, just 13 hours after the violent scene that unfolded in El Paso, Texas. Johnson tells me it is his belief that the common denominator in both of these events deals with suspects who, for whatever reason, made a decision to unleash violence and death on complete strangers.
Our country does not have the kind of healthy families, healthy communities, healthy faith communities that we need. And as a country, I think we all need to ask ourselves, what do we do collectively? What do we do individually to try to build back the kind of bonds and the relationships that identify when people need help?
The congressman believes that is the root issue, deeply troubled people with personal problems that spiral out of control, which leads to gunfire and death. And he says that issue is manifesting itself in other ways as well, ways that are easy to see but can be tough to manage and deal with.
We focus on the mass shootings because they are terrible and they focus our attention, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, and so we have a tendency to think about those. But the reality is we had 45,000 people in this country commit suicide last year. We had 70,000 people die because of drug overdoses. We have substantial behavioral health, mental health issues in this country that we have got to deal with. And mass shootings, while they are a terrible part of that problem, they are just a part.
But another common denominator of all this are the suspects' use of semi-automatic weapons, guns capable of firing a high number of rounds towards whomever may be in the way. I asked the congressman directly if he has any belief that these weapons are part of the problem, and should anything be done to change existing gun laws in America regarding those weapons.
If we believe that the Second Amendment means something, and if we acknowledge that fewer than 1% of deaths in this country come about because of firearms, and that most of those, 2/3, are suicides, and that most of the rest are because of handguns, we have to acknowledge that focusing all of this attention on rifles is not going to save as many lives as we're addressing the root causes of what we can do to make this country healthier.
Congress is in its August recess right now, but in a battle divided along partisan lines, Democrats are calling on Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell to call the Senate back to Washington to consider 2 pieces of gun legislation that passed out of the House last February. One would prohibit most person-to-person firearm sales unless a background check could be conducted. The second would extend the time a firearms dealer must wait for a response from the background check system before a sale can proceed from 3 days to 10 days. A check of House voting records shows Congressman Johnson voted no on both of those measures.
The reality is we still have people, Americans, who in their heart want to impose terrible destruction on friends, families, strangers, communities. You can take the rifles out of their hand, but if you don't take the hate out of their heart, you are just pushing them toward knives and handguns and other instruments of death. Let's fix the problem. And I feel like focusing on the machinery, on the tools. While I'm willing to have that conversation, let's not be afraid to have any policy discussion. Let's also not be afraid to look deeper to try to identify why do people have hate in their hearts.
And we do thank South Dakota Congressman Dusty Johnson for spending some time with us on tonight's This Week in Politics.